I'm Steve Wilkerson, and I'm with Jim Saunders, Executive Editor of the News Service of Florida. Jim, we see ads all the time on television now. Fantasy football, fantasy baseball, basketball, fantasy sports, the whole spectrum. It's become a multi-million, probably multi-billion-dollar enterprise backed by big money, and Senate President Andy Gardner is talking about the possibility of regulating it or prohibiting it in Florida. Big-time lobbyists are now being hired. Is this potentially a big issue legislatively and otherwise in the works?
Well, as you alluded to, if you turn on a football game this season, it is full of ads for DraftKings and FanDuel, which are the two big fantasy sports companies. And it's become a national issue. The question is whether it's gambling or whether it isn't. And the industry says it's not, that it's a game of skill, they say, so it's not gambling. But a whole lot of other people think it is gambling. And Senate President Andy Gardner is a longtime opponent of gambling. And he told us in an interview last week that he thinks the state should look at it. And he's got his staff looking at the issue. And he even drew a comparison to internet cafes, which, if you remember a few years ago, were an industry that popped up all over the place and was accused of illegal gambling, and essentially was run out of business. So this is an issue that's going to be interesting to watch going forward. As you mentioned, the industry has hired some big name lobbyists in Tallahassee, Brian Ballard and Max Stepanovich being two of them, and which is a pretty good indication that there is an issue brewing when you spend that kind of money on lobbyists. They've also made some fairly significant campaign contributions recently. So I think this is going to be an issue to watch in the legislative session that starts in January. And, there's a whole bunch of other gambling issues out there at this point as well. So, it possibly could even get wrapped into some of these other discussions.
It seems that one way or the other, gambling gets on the dais of the legislature every year. This one's kind of a surprise one, except it's nationwide. It's not just in Florida. And it might not just be gambling or no gambling. It may be gambling in one way against gamblers who see some money getting out of their kind of gambling into another kind of gambling, right?
Well, the easiest way to look at that is the Nevada Gaming Commission a couple of weeks ago determined that this online fantasy sports industry was gambling. And, of course, the industry has quickly said, well, the Nevada Gaming Commission is trying to protect casinos, which make a ton of money out of sports books. So, and if that's the case, you could certainly see why the casino industry would be against this fantasy sports industry. But you can also you can extend that to the other types of gambling that go on in Florida. We have tribal casinos, we have pari-mutuel facilities, and if people are spending their money on the online fantasy sports as opposed to going to a facility, a pari-mutuel facility or a tribal casino, you could see why those parts of the industry would be opposed to the massive expansion that's gone on with this fantasy industry in the first place. Fantasy sports have been around for a long time, probably maybe 30 years. And they started out as kind of being these, group of friends get together, pitch in a little bit of money, pick their teams, and, see how it comes out at the end of the year. I sort of liken it to guys sitting around playing poker on Thursday night, But now it's become a big business, and it's all on, or not all, but a lot of it's online. And so it's really jumped into prominence in the past few months.
And some of the biggest names in sports are involved as huge investors.
Well, that's one of the interesting things to me is that traditionally professional sports have been against gambling on sporting activities. So, but if you look at who's investing in the fantasy industry, as well as the advertising that they are doing on professional sports games, there's a very close connection, it appears, And in the end, I think it's going to come down to how it's viewed as whether it is gambling or not, and that may drive a lot of the regulatory decisions in Florida and elsewhere.